Mein Name ist Bernd Rixinger, ich bin seit einem halben Jahr jetzt Vorsitzender der Rosa-Luxemburg-Stiftung und wie so ist, Vorsitzende sollen bei wichtigen Veranstaltungen auch gerne mal eine Einführung in die Veranstaltung machen und die Begrüßung, was ich natürlich jetzt sehr gerne machen werde. Dieser Tage überschlugen sich die Meldungen über die heißesten Tage, die wir hierzulande jemals erlebt haben. Überall klagten die Krankenhäuser über überfüllte Notaufnahmen, übervolle Kältekammern, die Zunahme von Hitzeschlägen, Kreislaufzusammenbrüchen und Herzinfarkten. Besonders betroffen sind ältere Menschen und Kinder. Die Zahl der Hitzetoten steigt seit Jahren. Das Bizarre dabei, es wird der kälteste Sommer für die nächsten Jahre gewesen sein oder gar Jahrzehnte, denn künftig wird es noch wärmer. Dabei ist der Hitzesommer nur ein kleiner Ausschnitt, wie der Kapitalismus die stofflichen Grenzen nicht mehr nur lokal oder regional, sondern in planetarischem Maßstab überschreitet. Aktuellen Studien zufolge sind von 9 planetarischen Grenzen 6 erreicht. Neben der Erderwärmung sind dies das Artensterben, die Landnutzung, die Störung biogeochemischer Kreisläufe, der Süßwasserverbrauch und die Einbringung neuartiger Substanzen in Boden und Atmosphäre. Obwohl die Klimakatastrophe für die Menschen in den europäischen Ländern im Alltag erfassbar ist und erfahrbar ist, für die Menschen im globalen Süden ist das übrigens schon seit Jahrzehnten der Fall, erleben wir gerade einen Rollback bei der Klimapolitik, eingeleitet von der Europäischen Union und umgesetzt von den überwiegend konservativen Regierungen mit oder ohne Beteiligung der Sozialdemokraten und Grünen. Die ins Stottern gekommene Kapitalakkumulation soll durch die Senkung von ökologischen und sozialen Kosten wieder in Gang gebracht werden. Die heute vorherrschende Produktionsweise, die auf dem Prinzip beruht, dass anfallende ökologische und soziale Kosten systematisch nach außen, in den globalen Süden, an die ärmeren Menschen oder in die Zukunft verlagert werden, soll von ausgemachten Wachstumshemmnissen befreit werden. Dabei wird doch immer deutlicher, dass der Kapitalismus mit seinem eingebauten Wachstumszwang die ökologischen Krisen nicht lösen kann. Angesichts der dramatischen Situation, die menschheitsgefährdend ist, nehmen die Debatten und Maßnahmen der Regierenden groteske und gefährliche Züge an. Das fast schon religiöse Festhalten am Verbrennermotor, weiterhin fast ungebremster Einbau von Gas- und Ölheizungen, ungehemmter motorisierter Individualverkehr, die Lockerung ohnehin bescheidener Umweltauflagen scheinen wichtiger zu sein als Maßnahmen gegen die Klimaerwärmung und die Zerstörung der ökologischen Lebensgrundlagen auf den Weg zu bringen. Obwohl längst Daten über die in die Billionenhöhe gehenden ökonomischen Kosten der Umwelt- und Klimakatastrophe vorliegen, unter anderem von der Versicherungswirtschaft, und bekannt ist, welche sozialen Verheerungen mit einhergehen, wird weiterhin so getan, als gäbe es einen Widerspruch zwischen ökonomischen, sozialen und ökologischen Erfordernissen. Das geht einher mit einem verkürzten Wohlstandsbegriff, der bei der permanenten Steigerung der individuellen Konsumption und dem westlichen Mittelschichtsmodell stecken geblieben ist. Unser Gast, Dipesh Chakrabarty, hat zutreffend geschrieben, ich zitiere, es ist an der Zeit, dass wir uns von den energiefressenden, ressourcenplündernden, lebenszerstörenden und ungerechten Visionen des guten Lebens lossagen, die privilegierte Menschen in den vergangenen Jahrzehnten vorgelebt haben. Herzlich willkommen bei der Stiftung. Diese Feststellung ist natürlich das genaue Gegenteil von den weltweit erstarkenden nationalistischen, rechtsradikalen und faschistischen Ideologien und Kräften, die nicht nur den Klimawandel leugnen, sondern mit ihrem barbarischen Weltbild den fossilen Kapitalismus in autoritärer Form am Leben erhalten wollen. Und ich glaube nicht, dass Trump, der ja manchmal auch für dumm gehalten wird, nicht weiß, dass die Klimaerwärmung menschengemacht wird oder dass das andere nicht wissen. Aber was sie auf alle Fälle wissen, ist, es reicht nicht mehr für alle, wenn wir so weitermachen. Und die Logik der Rechten ist aber eine andere wie die der Linken. Die Logik der Rechten ist, es muss ja nicht für alle reichen. Es reicht doch, wenn es für uns reicht und für die gehobenen weißen Mittelschichten in den entwickelteren Ländern, praktisch der westlichen Hemisphäre, für die muss es reichen. Deswegen rüsten wir heute bis an die Zähne auf, um die Ressourcenkämpfe der Zukunft zu führen. Deshalb bauen wir Mauern und Stacheldraht um unsere Länder, damit Geflüchtete nicht mehr ins Land kommen können. Und deswegen sagen wir den Leuten oder sagen Sie den Leuten, ihr könnt gerade so weitermachen wie gehabt, es spielt eh keine Rolle. Die Linken können so eine Ideologie niemals annehmen. Linker Internationalismus heißt immer, es muss eine Perspektive, eine Zukunft, ein gutes Leben für alle Menschen auf der Welt geben und nicht nur für einen eingeschränkten Teil. Das unterscheidet uns dramatisch von den Rechten. Und ich glaube oder ich freue mich auf unseren weiteren Gast, Eva Katharina von Redecker, die sich nicht nur mit den Klimafragen, sondern auch über den neuen Faschismus auseinandergesetzt hat. Herzlich willkommen. Die wichtigste Herausforderung für einen linken Internationalismus besteht darin, der Weltbevölkerung ein gutes Leben zu ermöglichen, das gleichzeitig mit den Reproduktionskreisläufen der Natur in Einklang gebracht werden kann. Wenn Ressourcen knapper werden, muss ihre Verwendung global geplant und gleichberechtigt organisiert werden. Die extraktive Ausplünderung von Rohstoffen muss durch eine umfassende Dekolonialisierung, schwieriges Wort, der Handels- und Tauschbemühungen aufgehoben werden. Der Umbau von Ökonomie und Gesellschaft mit dem Ziel, die menschlichen Grundbedürfnisse zu befriedigen und die ökologischen Grenzen nicht zu überschreiten, erfordert einen grundlegenden Umbau von Ökonomie und Gesellschaft. Dazu gehören sicherlich die Änderung von Eigentumsformen hin zu Gemeineigentum und ein System demokratischer Planung auf allen Ebenen. Und es geht auch um einen neuen Wohlstandsbegriff, um ein neues Verständnis vom guten Leben, der nicht von größtmöglichem Konsum, sondern von guter materieller Grundversorgung, umfassenden sozialen Infrastrukturen und einer deutlichen Verkürzung der Lebens- und Wochenarbeitszeit ausgeht und uns allen die Kontrolle über unser Leben wieder zurückgibt. Diese Infrastrukturen der öffentlichen Grundversorgung sind auch deutlich besser als der Privatsektor mit dem Konzept regionaler Kreislaufökonomien zu vereinbaren. Diese Positionen müssten mit einer Erzählung verbunden werden, was wir damit an Lebensqualität und an Lebensmöglichkeiten gewinnen können. Nicht, was wir verlieren, sondern was wir gewinnen können. Vielleicht könnte diese Brücke zu einem solchen Politikansatz Violetta Bock schlagen, die es als Mitglied des Bundestages für die Partei Die Linke ganz konkret mit dem Rollback bei der Klimapolitik, bei gleichzeitigen massiven Angriffen auf die Sozialsysteme und struktureller Unterfinanzierung der sozialen und öffentlichen Infrastruktur zu tun hat. Herzlich willkommen. Ich freue mich auf die Veranstaltung mit euch allen und mit Britta Petersen als Moderatorin. Auch du, herzlich willkommen. Vielen Dank für eure Aufmerksamkeit.
Can you hear me? Yes. Yes, thank you very much, Bernd, for this very apt introduction and for setting a competitive tone here for our discussion. I think after this hot weekend here in Berlin, it's really necessary. Let me also say a few words about our guests today here on the panel. The discussion will be structured in such a way that we first have a short statements by the panelists. Then we will enter into a conversation here on the panel, and after that we will open the floor to the audience for a discussion. So let me say a few words about Dipesh Chakrabarty again. He is, obviously he is very well known already, and he is an Indian historian and leading scholar of post-colonial theory and subaltern studies. Dipesh is the Lawrence A. Crimpton Distinguished Service Professor for History and South Asian Studies at the University of Chicago. And among his best-known books are Provincializing Europe, Post-Colonial Thought and Historical Difference, and The Climate of History in a Planetary Age. And these will be basically the works that we will be referring to most on this evening. Eva von Redecker is a German critical theorist and feminist philosopher based in Brandenburg. She has authored a number of books, among them Revolution for Life, Philosophy of the New Forms of Protests, Freedom to Remain, and the latest, This Craving for Harshness about the New Fascism. Violetta Bock is a member of parliament, as Bernd already said, of Die Linke, and she also has authored a book titled An Indecent Proposal Using Left-Wing Populism to Combat the Elites and the Right. And she also has, I think this is very important in these days, a black belt in karate. Welcome to all of you. Climate change, as Bernd was already talking about, is not merely an ecological crisis. It is also transforming the way we understand history, politics, and society. Dipesh Chakrabarty describes humankind as a geological force, given its profound impact on the Earth system. The planetary perspectives challenges traditional political categories and notions of progress. The Benjamin Lectures, a cooperation between the Center for Social Critique at Humboldt University here in Berlin and the Rosa-Luxemburg-Stiftung, took place last week here at the Haus der Kulturen der Welt. Titled The Second Decline of the West, it focused on a new reading of Dipesh's book, Provincializing Europe. I don't know who of you, maybe you can raise your hand, were attending the Benjamin Lectures. I think, yeah, quite a few. I think you have an advantage because I think at this event, Dipesh already laid out over 3 days a lot of what is important in his theory, but I'm sure we will be able to catch up tonight as well. Tonight we want to concentrate on another aspect of his oeuvre and extend it by bringing 2 new perspectives into the picture. Eva von Redecker's work rooted in critical theory and Violetta Bock's experiences as a politician. We will discuss the climate crisis based on Chakrabarty's book, The Climate of History in the Planetary Age from 2021, and Eva von Redecker's 2 books, Bleibefreiheit from 2023, and to some extent Revolution für das Leben from 2020. Violetta Bock will add perspectives of practical politics into this discussion. How is the climate crisis changing our understanding of politics, democracy, and responsibility? Are national interests and traditional notions of growth and redistribution still sufficient to respond to the planetary challenges of the 21st century? And what new forms of political thought are emerging in the Anthropocene? I would like to start with asking each of you a few questions, and I would request you to answer in about 6 to 7 minutes so that we are, bringing everybody on board and have a common understanding of what we are talking about tonight. I will start with Dipesh. Dipesh, what does it mean to think of humans as a geological force? Could you kindly explain the difference between global and planetary history? And how does your approach change the way we see climate change? How does it affect our ability to act politically?
Thank you. You can all hear me, right? In the back? Okay, thank you. And good evening. And just before I answer your questions, I should say that I have wonderful memories of speaking at the Rosa-Luxemburg Foundation, maybe in 2012 or thereabouts. I was speaking about Marx and the heritage of Marxism. But I also have to apologize to people I recognize in the crowd who've not only been at my lectures, but there are also some people who actually read drafts of the lectures, worked their way through those drafts. So if I repeat myself on certain things, my apologies in advance. Climate change is an evolving topic. And even what we understand why climate change changes, while climate change changes how we understand things. In the last the experience of this heat wave in Europe, and I've just come back from Paris, came back last night, and the Parisians I spoke to were all discussing, and maybe you have been here as well, the question of the air conditioner. Should we or should not we? And my prediction is that if Paris has to host so many tourists from America and other places in summer, it will have to think about this air conditioning question seriously. And while we understand air conditioning is not good for the planet, but maybe for a restaurateur in Paris, it's a matter of keeping his business or her business, surviving today so that you can deal with tomorrow. So it's a problem in which there is both, even the privileged people of the world are facing the question of survival, in that you might say, we can't anymore do without something like air conditioner, you know. Particularly, I mean, I know of a little Indian child who was born in Germany, I would want to say 4 weeks ago, from his family. And the summer was already producing such rash on his body and in his body that his Indian parents were regretting, you know, the absence of an air conditioner. Some places don't even have fans. I mean, we've been scrambling to get some fans. So it's an evolving problem, and it's a problem that affects our everyday life sometimes in some aspects, and sometimes it don't. So that's another way of saying that it's not one thing. Climate change is many things. It is changing of the climate of the planet as a whole. It is about health. It is about heat-related illnesses for old people and young people. It is about, it is gendered. When it comes to health, it is gendered. Like in India, in the coastal India, because fresh water is becoming salty. Stop me when I've got finished my 6 minutes. Okay, so when where fresh water is becoming salty, often women from poor families have to go even further to get fresh water to cook with, because you can't cook with salt water. In my part of India where I come from, in the Bay of Bengal, both in Bangladesh and in India, rivers are becoming salty in the estuary. And there are poor women from fishing folks who stand in the water all day, like waist deep, with cane baskets catching small fish. And the salt is producing fungal infections in their reproductive organs. And it so happened that a bunch of very mischievous and bad doctors moved in and were charging these women a lot of money to do hysterectomy. And actually, if you have hysterectomy done, then you can't carry weight. And poor women have to carry weight. So I would have never associated hysterectomy with climate change. Something so intimate with climate change. Until some of my feminist friends in the city told me that they were lobbying the government, the state government, to regulate hysterectomy. So from big decisions like, do we have nuclear energy? Or should I have what's going on inside my body? Climate change operates on these different various scales of both personal life, regional life, collective life. And I'll just give you another example where the scale changes so much. So if you think of the Himalayas, so there are glacier-fed 9 rivers, 8 or 9 rivers that come out of these mountains and service countries from Pakistan to Vietnam. And the glaciers are receding, melting. The mountains are getting militarized by India, China, partly Pakistan. So that's another scale. It's not the world, but the Asian monsoon has to do with the La Nina and El Nino in the Pacific Ocean. And so the glaciers, what the glaciers do, what the winds do in the Pacific Ocean are connected. And rice cultivation in this area, right? So I'm just saying that that's another, it's not completely planetary, but it's planetary enough. The conveyor belt that gets warm water to Europe from the Atlantic, that is in the crisis of collapsing. But the glaciers and the conveyor belt are distant news. My hysterectomy is my immediate news. And what happens in many parts of the world, that in India with poor people, is that they didn't even know what's going on. The doctor can tell them lies, the doctor can extract money from them. So it's first thing I want to say is that it's an evolving problem, our understanding is evolving, and it is not one problem. It has so many aspects that it's very difficult to solve it in the way you solve a mathematical problem. Right? Yeah. So maybe I'll just end there.
Just follow up a little bit on that, because can you link what you just described very vividly to your theory that distinguishes between planetary and global history? Because I think it is important to have this distinction in the beginning, because a lot of will follow from that.
Okay.
Thank you.
So I will explain the distinction for those who, and that's most of you who probably haven't read me. So you have to, just to personalize the story, that I grew up, I'm an old man, so I grew up in the 60s as a young Maoist. And for me, the world was about justice and oppression and getting out of oppression, having a just social order, equalities of different kind, fairness. And if you think back to the world of the 1990s, one of the most interesting that happened in the 1990s is the development of Human Development Index that we now use, right? Instead of measuring countries how well they're doing by their GDPs, these indices were developed by economists like Amartya Sen, Mahbul Haq in the World Bank, Martha Nussbaum and others. And if you go back and read them in the 1990s, you would see that they used to think the main problem was inequality. The main problem was what you might call distributive justice, that there was enough food, there was enough of everything. Inequality was the main problem. That you might call global history. So global history is mainly about human beings and their institutions like capitalism, their inequalities, their injustices like colonialism, imperialism. So global history is comes out of the world that Europe made through colonization, through European expansion, through enslaving other people, all of these things. And basically through technology. When scientists were saying, and I was shocked to read them say this, I read them in 2003, I began to read them, so I was late, but when I began to read them, they were saying that mainly privileged human beings whose numbers were growing, because of their numbers, levels of consumption, technology, were having an impact on biodiversity, on life on the planet. That was like the impact of the asteroid that killed off the dinosaurs 65 million years ago. Oil company specialists were actually one of the first to find out that there was a big global warming, planetary warming, 55 million years ago, before humans. And that involved 10 degree Celsius rise of the average temperature, but the rise was happening over 10,000 years. And they realized that it's warming up now and it's happening faster, right? Exxon suppressed that research. So from looking at the impact of the planet, that human fights, struggles about justice, we realized that we were affecting not just human inequalities or human politics, we were affecting this whole planet, changing its climate. So therefore we had another kind of existence, they were saying. This is the existence like a thing, like a volcanic eruption, which is a geological agent. And that gave me the sense that, in English, that the word globe in globalization had a meaning that was different from the word globe in global warming. And I began to make a distinction. I called the globe of global warming planet, and the globe of globalization the globe. And I realized that if you look at us from the global perspective of capitalism, empire, things we normally study at Marxists, your study becomes mainly of human beings, and you have a perspective which is anthropocentric. When you look at ourselves through the perspective of what was happening to the planet, you suddenly realize that when you insert us in the history of life, in the history of the planet, then humans arrive in the history of the planet. If you imagine the age of the planet to be 100, let's say the Earth dies when the Earth is 100. We come around when the Earth is 80. So we are very, in English you said, Johnny come latelys, right? We come late. We are not at the center of the story of the planet. And you realize that we are a minor form of life. Just a branch of apes that got a bigger brain, became curious, intelligent, smart, intelligent enough to work out the origin of cosmos, the history of the planet, but also very destructive. And now the topmost predator in the world in terms of other forms of life. And you also realize that the oxygen we breathe, other forms of life supply that oxygen. Phytoplanktons, bacteria. You realize that in the history of life, bacteria are more important than we are. So that, there's a project I'm trying to do with a French artist as a classroom in Chicago, which we are calling Becoming Minor. If you're a minor form of life, how do you live and pursue justice in a world between human beings, while also expressing through your forms of living the fact that you are a minor form of life, but you become dominant. You're dominating all forms of life. So if all forms of life were human, then this would look like apartheid. you see what I'm saying? I mean, if the polar bear were human, if the tigers were human, and I was once showing a Silicon Valley friend the rapidity with which the human population has expanded and human longevity has expanded. So there are more humans and they live longer thanks to technology and biomedicine and all that. And my friend said, he called me Dipesh Da, which in Bangla means older brother. And he said, Dipesh Da, if the tiger population was growing at that rate, we would be worried. And I said, yes, and if tigers could read to learn these graphs, they would be worried too, right? So basically, and that's what I call the planetary perspective. That is looking at ourselves. It's something that only human beings can do, as far as I know, which is to get out of our own being and look at ourselves from the way we imagine the point of view of a tiger, polar bear, microbes, bacteria, otherwise. So the planetary perspective decenters humans. The global perspective is about humans, and I was arguing that we need to look at ourselves from both perspectives at once. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think that made it very clear. Thank you. I would like to bring in Eva here now. Eva, you have developed a concept of Bleibefreiheit, the freedom to stay. And you argue that ecological emancipation is not the freedom to exhaust the resources of a planet and move on, as probably Elon Musk would suggest, but the freedom to inhabit and preserve an environment over time. Could you please explain this concept? And how can we make this process of emancipation possible in a world deeply structured by capitalist logic?
Yeah, I'll try. Thank you. I want to say at the outset, though, or I would want to say that I'm so honored to be sitting here and also a bit intimidated. But last time I was in this house, Wolf Fritz Haug told me, you cannot say honored. That's a feudal category. So I'm in a lot of joy and a bit daunted to be sitting here. Maybe to get at this turn of phrase of the freedom to stay, one could say that this thinking started for me out of, on the one hand, a political despair over both the fact that the concept of freedom suddenly worked so well for the right, and especially young ecological activists occasionally started telling me, oh, if freedom, that's over. Now we just, we have to fight for survival. And I actually think you have a huge misunderstanding of what survival as the animal we are entails if you think you can drop the question of freedom. Like it's a scary prospect. So that was the one thing. Like can we like this despair to not want to let the concept go to the right, and also to me just the thought that a lot of public debate seemed to locate a loss of freedom on very extraneous practices, like, certain types of traffic banning or something. That's costing freedom. But losing planetary biodiversity, losing inhabitable climate zones, somehow seemed not to be touching on the question of freedom. And I mean, that just seems insane. So part of the kind of drive was just like, that can't be true. We have to be able to think differently. And then there is this other thing, which is just a very kind of, philosophy often starts because philosophers are a bit dumb and they keep puzzling over the same thing. And I just had this very naive thought that it's weird that we always think of freedom intuitively as the freedom to move, like to be able to go somewhere, to expand in space, to go wherever I want in a certain area. But we don't have the complementary idea of a freedom to stay. And I mean, I don't know, maybe at first, of course, one has lots of ideas, and maybe I was like, maybe I'm just sort of very homebound and there's nothing to the idea. But actually, I convinced myself that at a planetary moment where the inhabitable regions of the Earth are shrinking, and also at a historical moment where there is talk of deportation we face, there's genocide and warfare, like the freedom to stay, to be allowed to stay in a place, suddenly gains a lot of weight. It's really something that is worth fighting for. Maybe even the thing we need to prioritize. Obviously they hang together. Like if you cannot move, then staying is not a freedom, then it's an imperative. So they're kind of dialectically linked, but maybe it's a good moment to prioritize this freedom to stay. And I think then the additional thought that helped me kind of do something with that idea was that, you know, if you think spatially, then of course staying, it's kind of pretty boring. It's just doing nothing. So it's sort of the 0.0 of freedom. But staying as a verb has a temporal dimension. In order to stay, you know, life has to go on. This place needs to be sustained. Somebody needs to feed rather than attack me. So you can use this figure of staying to kind of change the dimension from spatial to temporal. And maybe last loop, actually, if we think about what the notion of liberal freedom suggests to us, to demand and experience as freedom, it's a weirdly time-blind concept. And of course, like criticizing the liberal notion of freedom, it's kind of the core business of what critical theory does. You know, there are many very sophisticated accounts of what we don't like about it. It's too formal, it's too individualistic. And it seems kind of oddly over-abstract to say, oh, the problem with liberal freedom is that it's spatial. But I think it adds, or it kind of helps us bundle some of the other perspectives, because the core idea of how we think of freedom is that it's what I can do, because I own myself, I can do in the delineated sphere that only pertains to myself, whatever I want to do. And it stops where the same sphere of the equal other starts. So I have to respect that. So it has those two components. And it's always assessed in the moment. It's almost like as if it's a playing field that you look at with bird's eye view. So the question of whether I can still breathe, like with or without air conditioning tomorrow, doesn't really enter the question. Tomorrow I just ask again, oh, what's blocking my way? Or where can I go? And actually, like when the freedom was started to be discussed, like in political philosophy in the Western world, the first suggestions were very literal about this connection between freedom and freedom to move. Like in Hobbes, for instance, he says only bodies, physical bodies that can move in space can have freedom because only they can move. Or then 100 years later, in the 18th century, William Blackstone, the British jurist, said freedom is locomotion. Which is kind of very beautiful because it also has the locomotive of history metaphor, but it's moving. And then you might say, well, but more sophisticated ideas of autonomy obviously don't just think freedom as a block rolling around, but even the idea that I can kind of put my will wherever I want has a spatial movement aspect to it. Like it's like how much leeway does my will have? It's still a sort of spatial metaphor in which time doesn't enter. And even though, as we've of course learned also from Dipesh Chakrabarty's earlier work, where he talks about the historicism of the Western tradition, of course there is also a particular temporality tied to Western liberal freedom, so that of linear progress. But that's speaking with Benjamin, you would say that's empty time. That's just kind of accumulating the same thing over and over again. It's just having that empty space to move over and over again. So what I then thought is that we need a different and richer account of the temporality that makes us free. So rather than having space to move around, we should have time, fulfilled time. And well, if I have half a minute left, I think, and that's kind of, I don't know whether this is correct, but in a kind of neo-existentialist vein, then I try to have a phenomenology of what temporalities do human animals need to be free. And I think that, or I came up, I'm sure it's not complete, with three, where one is just the linear time sort of towards death to live at all. I mean, you need to live to be free. But then second, the kind of more fanning out or also more infinite temporality that with Hannah Arendt we could call the new beginnings. So the ability to start time, that humans can set a new beginning, to start time anew, kind of this, it's thinking about time from through birth rather than through death. And then I think there is a third that we also need, that also Hannah Arendt wasn't so aware of. And that is, in order to start anything and also to go on living, you need to not die of exhaustion. So we need the kind of cyclical time of restoration, of kind of lots of metabolic cycles replenishing what we, but also what all ecosystems, what the kind of planetary critical zone needs in order to persist in time. So I think that this kind of, I call it regenerative time, is the third type of time. It's of course a stretch to call it time, but the third temporality that we need in order to be free. So we also need to be free, to just recover ourselves for certain cycles to keep on happening. And if you have, I think it's a bad imaginary of ecological breakdown as this sort of apocalypse in the future, this one moment. What actually happens is that lots of those cyclical tides desynchronize. And then first there is some adaptation, and then things start to drop because, the insects aren't there when the birds need them, and the water isn't there when the trees need it. And so then you have local and eventual, even much bigger system collapse. And so I think fighting for freedom also means fighting for such cyclical tides.
Violetta, as a member of parliament, as a politician, what do you take away from these deliberations that we heard here? Do they?
No, I think it should
follow
be the
up.
other way
No,
around.
this is too big a question. No, do they inspire you? Do you agree with what has been said? And what do you think? What role do democracy, social movements, and international solidarity play in this crisis that we are in at the moment?
So yeah, also first of all, good evening, and I'm also honored, even if not allowed to saying it, to be with you on this panel. And I'm not a philosopher, so more on the practical things. And of course, I think the concepts are really inspiring. I mean, if what Dipesh said, also that I think also for everyday politics, it often helps to zoom out. Because even in these dark times, to have always in mind, it's not only about the moment now, but history is going on. Because when people tell us capitalism is the end of history, we always can say, well, look, some 100 years ago, there was no capitalism before. And society is moving, and we can change things that maybe at the moment don't seem like you can change them, but it sometimes just takes some time. So I think even in the temporal, zooming out helps. And decentralizing humans, yes, and still maybe I would also say a bit no, or maybe ask the question, or not as a contradiction to the analysis of Marxism. Because of course for me, as a socialist, I would say the class struggle is still of much relevance. I mean, of course, the climate catastrophe, I agree absolutely, it changes every aspect of life. It's not just a climate issue, and I mean in the climate movement, at the moment there are also, as it's not that big as some years ago, I think there are some discussions actually also in a positive way, because it's rethinking the way how we did climate politics, like on the peak of Fridays for Future. Was it the right one, or what can we take from the critiques at that time? And it's more moving together with the justice question as well, and we have to combine social and ecological aspects, because otherwise if you just do climate politics, and we can see that at the current government, I mean, some climate politics is just making the climate catastrophe even worse. But some things, if you don't have this social aspects also seeing it, or what does it mean for all the other aspects of life, as Eva said, it's just deepening the social inequality we have. So we always have to connect it together. And this is what I mean when I say the climate catastrophe Like, is it really about pushing climate at first, or is it more like in an intersectional way, seeing it as a material condition that shapes everything, and that we have to respect it? Every political things where we demand things, we always have to think about the ecological consequences of it. So maybe that's one point. Of course, air conditioning also was a big debate. And I mean, also in the, like, when I try to understand the planetary version, also in the intertemporal aspect. I mean, I was last week here in the parliament. We had the sessions, and I didn't feel the heat. It was air conditioned all day. And I mean, we have like that 16 hours, 12 hours a day, and you just move into air-conditioned rooms. And of course, you talk about the 40 degrees outside and you hear from the neighbors at home what it means that they are in apartments with 35 degrees, but you don't feel it at the moment when you are in these political rooms. And for me, it was, I mean, I didn't have it before that it was so, that the own material condition was so different from the ones that people felt. But I mean, that also shapes. And that's why, I mean, of course, you can say that humanity, you have to decentralize. But even then, if we think about the role of humans, it's not equal. And people are affected very differently. Of course, in the north and the south, but also here, between the poor and the rich people, and also the ones who profit from that system. I mean, that's why it's still continuing in the capitalist mode. And so that's why I would say we really have to think also about the concept of power, like how do we really change the power conditions? Also for the question of freedom. I mean, the freedom to move and the freedom to stay, I absolutely agree. And I think it's really good that you put in more also what does it mean, like the moment of exhaustion and how tired people are of all the stress on the different levels, and that we have to integrate that also in our doing. But also freedom is a question of power. Like who decides if Europe is built as a fortress and that walls are built outside? And how can we build power from below to reshape the power conditions? Maybe for now that's what I take. So thank you a lot for your work.
Yeah, thank you, Violetta. That was a beautiful anticipation of what I actually want to discuss now. The question of capitalism. One major point of divergence in ecological philosophy is whether humanity as a whole or capitalism is to blame. One is the Anthropocene, and the other is called the Capitalocene. Dipesh, you argue that the Anthropocene cannot solely be understood as a crisis of capitalism. That even if we successfully created a perfectly equal socialist global utopia, if it were still powered by fossil fuels, the geological disruption of the Earth system would remain the same. The Anthropocene exposes a shared biological vulnerability of the human species and of all other species for that matter. Given this situation, how do you answer the common view in the global south? And it's, well, basically the most common understanding raised by our friend Sunita Narayan and others, that the developed world has a bigger responsibility to tackle the climate crisis, as it has gained significantly longer from burning fossil fuels and thus contributed to the crisis longer and deeper. Is there a right to development, even when it exacerbates the crisis?
Thank you. Thank you both for your remarks and for this question. So just to clarify, and just stop me whenever you think I'm exceeding my time, because the questions are all...
I have another half an hour or so for our discussion here. So
I'll make some points quickly. So when the word Anthropocene was kind of put into use to describe the present condition, and that, as you know, happened in a conference in Mexico in 2000. So you have to remember that the IPCC is set up in 1988. The first time we hear about human activities really affecting the planet is through the news of holes in the ozone layer. And that became part of public discussion in the early 1980s, leading to the Montreal Protocol, which became the model for IPCC's Kyoto Protocol. So the UN, when that happened, we discovered that the UN probably was the agency through which to handle planetary problems. UN was actually set up to deal with nation-state problems, not with planetary problems. And the UN, like again, in the last century, if you asked me or somebody, how long would it take for Israelis and Palestinians to get over their problems? How long would it take for Kashmiris to have autonomy and not be split between India and Pakistan? The answer would be, it will take as long as it takes. Because the assumption of UN was that what you were calling empty homogeneous time, natural time, that the UN has tons of human time at its disposal, right? It's only with the climate news that we thought, oh dear, we don't have that much time. Right? So to go back to that point is that, so when the IPCC was set up, and there was a man who headed up the World Resources Institute, whose name escapes me. I'm having a senior moment about his name, but he was a professor of economics at Yale University. And he was one of the first people to describe this as humanity's problem. And then in 91, when the Rio conference on environment, global environment was held, and the UN was creating the UN framework for dealing with climate change, that's where Sunita Narayan and Anil Agarwal, two Indian activists, presented this idea that emissions should be calculated on a per capita basis because classes, nations, people are not equally responsible. So the Western nations, the industrialized nations, including Japan, clearly had more responsibility, historical responsibility for global warming, no question. Rich people had more responsibility than poor people. And the injustice of global warming is that it affects the more vulnerable. So it affects the old people more, it affects the poor people more, it has a gendered side, it can affect women more in certain ways, as I was saying before. And so they were pointing out to the injustice of the problem. And therefore they were saying the West, if there is let's say there's a carbon space, let's say of the unit 10. So their argument was every nation should have equal access to that carbon space. And the West has already hogged more than its share of carbon space. And therefore, the West should go down and we should come up. Actually, today, there's a site on the internet called The World in Data. And if you look at the emissions, you will find that the Western emissions are actually going down. And it's the Indian and Chinese emissions that are going up. So India, so you can say that the Western nations are retrospectively guilty, and India and China are prospectively guilty. It's a backloaded problem. So today's warming is created by the emissions that happened a few decades ago. Or, so it's a backloaded problem. And, but the other interesting thing is that if you look at the world in my lifetime, sort of after the Second World War, and as I say, India is just 1.5 years older than I am. So you will find the statistics are quite amazing because, so we're about more than 8 billion people. About 3 billion human beings live badly. 4 billion human beings constitute the global middle class. And the global middle class now belongs more to the countries of the global south, including China and India. So if you look at consumption, around 2000, the OECD countries were the major consumers of consumption gadgets. Now, their share is like 35%. If you look at the number of humans who consume, so this is happening in spite of growing inequality. In other words, growing equality does not mean that simply the rich are getting richer, the poor are getting poorer. growing inequality means that there is inequality growing, but there is also a class of super rich people, which we didn't have before, the Elon Musk and the Peter Thiel and the Jeff Bezos and all those people who are kind of super, super rich. There's an American journalist who written a book on them. He claims, as a scientist, that when you make so much money, you become mentally ill. And you lose interest in democracy, liberalism, and you just want to dominate the world. And you want to you want to have immortality for yourselves. So there's a project in California called Longevity Escape Velocity, right? That you'll escape. The only limits on longevity, they're writing wills that they assume will be legally valid for 1,000 years. That's the dream at one end. At another end, the ranks of the middle classes have grown. And of these 4 billion consumers, every second billion has been added faster than the previous billion. So I go back to what Eva was saying. The right to movement is a fundamental right for human beings. But the question is, does it make a difference whether billions of humans travel by bullock cart or horse carriage, or whether billions of humans travel by aeroplanes? So the question is of scale, and the interesting problem of scale is, and this happens with agriculture too, so if the human population goes from 10 to 100, so that's multiplied 10 times, it does not mean that everything associated with agriculture will also grow by 10 times. Some may grow by 15 times. Some may grow by 20 times. Because what happens is that when you have 4 billion people consuming so much, affecting the climate, it's going back to the cyclical time of the planet, Eva, that you were talking about, the hydrological cycle, the nitrogen cycle, the carbon cycle. These are non-linear processes. So when you see, humans are very good at seeing linear processes. But a non-linear process kind of ambushes us. So as the simple example that you give in the classroom is that if you have a test tube, and there are some little creatures in it, and you're kind of adding matter to the test tube, which is doubling, let's say every second. But the last second is where it goes from half to full. And these non-linear processes are very hard to actually feel until they're upon us. And that is the problem that scientists call the complexity problem. And my point is that while capitalism, let's say by that name, is to blame for the crisis, but the crisis is beyond the control of capitalism. And that's why I say that it needs more than capitalism. So I'm just finished by saying this. There was a kind of misunderstanding in the Anthropocene capitalism debate. The misunderstanding was this, that people assumed that when Paul Crutzen, the scientist who got the Nobel Prize, shared Nobel Prize for fixing the problem in the ozone layer, who has worked in one of the Max Plancks here, Dutch scientist, I think, atmospheric chemist. When he said Anthropocene, we are in the Anthropocene, not in the Holocene, that was almost 12 years after the IPCC had been set up. And after the Kyoto Protocol had been set up with 2 annexures in counting emissions, right, between luxury emissions and necessary emissions. So there was no way that Paul Crutzen would have been unaware that even if he used the word Anthropocene, he was not blaming every human being. Unfortunately, my Marxist friends, Andreas Malm and other people, again I can name them because they've said it in print, they read Anthropocene as a word that was blaming the anthropos, that is all human beings, equally for the crisis. That would have been impossible for a person of Paul Crutzen's knowledge to do 10 years or 9 years after the 91 conference and 12 years after IPCC had been set up. So I'll end there. Thank you.
Claude. Eva, let's stay a little bit with the power relations. The freedom to stay, the right to inhabit and preserve an environment has never been equally distributed. Throughout history, people have been enslaved, driven out of their habitats, dispossessed. The climate crisis is a continuation of this. Is it even possible to think of humanity as an agent, given this imbalance? And how are climate change, global inequality, patriarchal structures, and capitalist modes of production linked?
Right. Let's take it bit by bit. So I wouldn't say that it makes sense to talk of, like, in a way it follows up very much from what Dipesh just said, humanity as a mega subject or a group. And I don't think that suggesting a notion of freedom that asks that everybody has a place to stay and stay free in any way suggests that this stage was already reached. I mean, if freedom is a universal negative concept, you use it to scandalize the situation where many people didn't have the freedom to stay, right? So the fact that historically this wasn't fulfilled, it kind of proves the need. Then I don't think it's correct. It goes with what Dipesh just said, with we are very bad to see exponential lines. We can't just say climate crisis continues previous waves of dispossession, you know? It really escalates them. It really, and I mean, at the moment, it kind of double escalates because even capitalism itself is escalating, you know, in the kind of unfettered neoliberal tech monopolist hellscape. So it is hard to grasp that there's really happening more than a continuation. And I think it makes sense to speak of the Anthropocene not just in the way that it is introduced, and I think Dipesh's formulation is very beautiful to say that humanity has become a geological force, and of course that doesn't imply all humanity equally. But I think it makes even more sense to think of the Anthropocene as a condition affecting all humankind if you think of it from the other end, as that affects all humans. And then again, it affects them vastly differently, but we have now reached a threshold where all future, or at least sort of depending on who you ask, the next 100,000 years of humankind will be affected by the emissions of the past. You know, that's really new. Normally, the way that power functions is that it can be incredibly oppressive, but when you topple it, you've won. And then, yes, you have some wounds to care for, you have some trauma that lives on a bit, but you have some buildings that are destroyed, but now a new era starts. And with the Anthropocene now, we really, certain things will not go away from the climate, even if we won. And of course we need to want to win, you know, that's what politics is there for. So I think it is really important to get one's head around that, because it fundamentally changes the outlook of what also a socialist liberation project is. Because in sort of socialism of old of the 19th century thought the only problem was to reappropriate and freely collectively organize the riches. And now we know, like, whatever happens, even if we get emancipation, we will have to redistribute the repair work, like the kind of working against catastrophe. So there is also the debris or the litter, the abject things, nature, that somehow needs to be dealt with. And I think that's the way in which I kind of see this humble gesture of saying we need to think of humans as a minor position. At the same time, I kind of rebel against that formulation because, and I mean, you brought up the tension yourself. If we have become a geological force now, I think it's almost coward to be like, oh, now we're done, now we're really small, you know, let's see what Gaia does. No, we have discovered that we have this enormous power that we didn't think we have. Just that kind of, I mean, that's an old Marxist thought, right? That the way we organize our society unleashes forces, anonymous forces, sort of behind our back that structure the society. Now we see we've unleashed forces that structure the planet. So we can't now be like, oh, we should be more modest. No, nobody else is going to do the tidying up. It's only humans that can all not just reproduce their own species, but also consciously think, what does the repair and sort of restitution of other species require? So I think that there are a lot of quite enormous also duties on us to become more major, and maybe I think that gives maybe more new life to this formula that the romantic early Marx, perhaps my favorite Marx, had when he said that we aren't human yet. We've never been human, so to say, because being human would be to live up to the potential of our species, to fully recognize each other's freedoms in mutual need satisfaction. And I think now this has just become, now we also have to become animals that mutually recognize sort of the regenerative needs of ecosystems. And I think looking for a historical agent that will liberate us, it's a kind of too trivial way to say, oh, which group is going to do the job? And now we somehow lost the proletariat. Oh, will humans do it? No, I think the materialist view of history is one that thinks that there is a certain activity, a certain self-activity, the liberation of which will transform the world in a free place. And kind of classic Marxism thought labor was that. And now we're like, damn, industrial labor definitely isn't. But I still think if we want to talk about something like an ecological class project, we have to think about what is the self-activity, what is the labor. So that's why I'm going on about this regeneration so much. It's something that, and it's sort of hopeful to think, to some extent, nature is doing the job for us. For some extent, it's happening while we sleep, we're being restored. But also, we gotta help it. You know, we need to do that kind of reparative work if we want to have a future. And I mean, I still haven't spoken enough about power. We don't have the power, we need to build the power, yes. But the philosophy is very kind of dumb, external, and useless in that process.
Thank you so much. Violetta, everything that we heard now is actually screaming inclusivity. No, we need to be more inclusive of, you know, even other species of. But what we see politically is actually quite the contrary: a rise in nationalism, in extractivism, in actually fascism. So, how can we counter this? Another big question.
Yeah, and I won't present the easy solution. Actually, I think labor is one big part of it. So if it's the question also, what are the driving forces? And I mean, first, maybe I agree that the whole world is moving very much to the far right. And also, as Bernd in the introduction said, I mean, I also don't think that the far right is just ignoring climate crisis. I mean, I think even Trump, when he pointed to Greenland, it was actually one answer in his way to climate crisis. It's just the answer that we don't want and that we are fighting. But I mean, their answer is, okay, they see resources will be scarce, so we make wars. Climate crisis is escalating, geopolitical wars as well. They built the fortress so that people then don't come to our green island where they play at least a bit energy transition, but also more in a way of green colonialism. But so that's one answer to the climate crisis that we don't want, or at least I think we all don't want it. So the question is, how do we get the inclusive way? And I mean, that's why I think it's so important to see it also as a conflict and to see who are the actors there. And I mean, maybe in Germany, the labor force is not that big as it has been years ago. But if you see it on an international scale, the labor class, the working class, is even bigger than before. And I mean, I also wouldn't point it only to the industrial labor. Probably we also agree there. And of course, we also have to see all the reproductive way that is also part of it. But so I think, yeah, we have to do the class struggle, and we have to interlink all the different things. I mean, as Dipesh said, even if we manage to come over capitalism, the climate crisis will still be there. But I mean, we also had that discussions also with feminism, that it won't be enough to have socialism. We still will have to fight patriarchy. So I think the intersectionality also helps there. It will still be a way, but we can only adapt and at the same time fight that the climate crisis will be stronger if we go away from that endless growth. So there I also agree, it's not this old development model, but we really have to rethink what is growth. So it's not more and more, but like the quality, and how do we build now durable infrastructure of collective life as well. And there, of course, inclusivity, like thinking and like bringing together all the different struggles and how they are interlinked is very important. And I think it is done actually on the very local level, where we have at the in the workplaces, in the neighborhoods, where we can bring this together and where we can live solidarity and also feel that we can build power, to come to that concept again, and to live it. Because the answer of the far right actually is, I mean, they don't, I would say, they don't neglect the climate crisis, they neglect that it's done by humans. And to neglect that actually means they say we don't have a chance to fight it. But I mean, as we know that it's humanity or the humans that caused and are escalating the climate crisis, we can also turn that around. And I mean, it's the question if we manage not to keep on the track of destruction, but if we manage like really to change the power relations and also become also a healing force. I mean, that's maybe very positive, but actually I think we can do that as we know actually what the solutions to so many things would be, like mobility. Not everyone needs the car if we have collective infrastructure, if we have short ways, and that can be started very locally.
Yeah, thank you so much. I have a lot of questions still on my list, but I think in the interest of time, I will throw this open now for questions and answers. So there are mics here, and you have the mics? Yeah. So if you actually could introduce yourself before you ask a question, and maybe also tell us who you are directing the question to, if that's the case. So are there any questions? Comments? Over there.
So if there are questions in German, there may be questions in German, right? It wasn't working, yeah. But maybe I did something wrong. Sorry, but yeah. Okay.
Otherwise, I can translate.
Okay, we'll speak English, so maybe.
So Dipesh, you did hear the translation from? No. Oh.
But I mean, we can proceed with the English.
I mean, if it's possible that you ask your questions in English, maybe that's the easiest. But yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, it's not so much a question. I think maybe it's like a comment. But
could you introduce yourself, please?
Hello, I'm Roberta. I'm an architect. I sit over here. Okay. Hello here.
Oh, okay.
And I feel the main difference between maybe a new understanding of the right and the left, and I think there's also a lot of relearning needs to be done in the left, is that the answer of the right to the climate crisis is technology. Either in the kind of green way of we carry on as we always have, we just switch everything to green technology, or the right-wing way of fortressing and like fighting just for the survival of a small elite. While I think a new understanding of like a left position vis-a-vis that would be that our answer to that crisis is not technology, but the ability to create meaningful relationships. And I feel this is actually the only answer out of this mess. And I see, yeah, I think the left has a lot of homework here. And I feel since we are in a left space here, we don't need to preach to the converted. And I think this is actually a conversation that I would like to see, to have. Like, what are the tools that you have to do that? How can we, like, yeah, practically become better in what I would call relationshiping? And I think this is also a way to think about it, like to stay porous, to stay open and inclusive, is like to train that muscle of being in relation with each other, but also with like non-human beings, with the material world and other life forms.
Thank you for this. It was probably not a question, but maybe you want to comment on it or have thoughts on it?
Just very briefly, yeah, thank you. I actually like the heavy existentialist weight of that. I do think we like asking the question of what the meaning is does help us move away from certain patterns. But I think it's also important not to let the right have that trajectory of sort of making us believe that technology has to develop the way it's currently developed by risk investment, that we either have no technology or that type of AI that is now proposed. You know, I think it's important always to say technology has a history and there are other technologies that maybe help us have meaningful lives and help us repair nature. And it's not the technology that is built at the moment. I think there is a real divergence of the tools not being neutral anymore, but forces of destruction. But that's, I think, how I would react to it. And otherwise, yes, I mean, the freedom to stay is about the freedom to stay together and stay in touch and in relation. So I hope it speaks to that a bit.
Yeah, I also agree. And I mean also because if one just points to technology, it means ignoring the causes of the crisis and why climate why it's escalating that much and destroying so much, because it ignores that it's the capitalist, imperialist society that is profit-driven and where some companies can just dictate so much over our life with exploiting us. And that's what I also meant when I said like the, I mean, we often look like on the big scale, but I mean, for creating meaningful relations, and we need them also to fight together, because also in these times we need trust to go in the big fights, as they are sometimes also risky. I mean, we have to take them, but this means that we trust each other, and this can, that also has to be done in a local level, like in our communities, in the neighborhoods, in the workplace. Like when you say to fight the boss, or when you fight your landlord, exactly, you need these relationships. So I would agree there that this is part also of training them, as you said, like training the muscles. And then, of course, not stopping at the local level, but connecting it to all the other places. And we have a lot of fights that are often not seen, but are already practiced on our daily life.
Is this working? Yeah, it's working. Quickly to add to what's been said is that my own sense of the crisis is that we will need technology. I'm not anti-technology, but I think we will need more targeted technology. So just to give you an example of what I mean, is that at the moment, the pesticide we use for growing crops are actually causing insecticides. That is, they're killing insects you don't want to kill. North America has a crisis of the bee population. And so you need more targeted technology. So if you look at the history of chemical industry, of which Germany was a pioneering country, and if you look at the destructive side of chemical industry, in the sense that a lot of the chemical industry produced poison that killed more things than you wanted to kill. So in our library, for instance, in Chicago, there's a discussion going on because there's a constant fight between my kind of bookworms and bookworms that actually eat books. You know, my kind of bookworms only read them, we destroy them in other ways. But bookworms read books. And the chemicals they use to deal with bookworms is actually just poison. So we were having a discussion as to whether or not what we need is more targeted technology. In other words, technological education should include education about biodiversity. We need to change how technologists are actually taught and trained. So in Chicago, for instance, people who work on lithium batteries know nothing of the downstream effects of lithium mining, which is studied in political science. And they don't talk to each other. But I think we need courses where they talk to each other. So that's why I think it's not, I mean, as Eva was saying, we will probably have a warming by the end of the century between 2.7 and 3 or 3.1 degrees. That's the forecast for now. That world will be a lot more uninhabitable than this world. And if we stopped all emissions today, I think as you were saying, the warming will continue. So we can't deal with this problem without technology. But it's really question is what kind of technology? Not just profit-making technology, as you were saying, but technological education that is itself environmentally informed. Yeah, thank you.
Ich bin gezwungen, auf Deutsch zu reden. Also ich hoffe, es klappt. Also mein Name ist Wolfgang und für mich ist die planetare Politik ein riesiger Hoffnungshorizont. Deshalb bin ich hier und ich wollte verstehen, was planetare Politik in ihren Grundzügen ist. Und Dipesh Chakrabarty fragen, ob vielleicht die Einstellung von... Also das funktioniert jetzt gar nicht.
Es scheint doch nicht zu funktionieren.
Ich kann sonst auch schnell übersetzen.
Sprechen?
Also wollen wir das lieber so lösen?
Also ich wollte Dipesh Chakrabarty, jetzt versteht er mich wahrscheinlich gar nicht.
I'm happy to translate.
Kannst du vielleicht auch auf Englisch die Frage stellen
No,
oder nicht?
we can translate here. Let the audience ask in German.
Also ich wollte Dipesh Chakrabarty fragen, ob er vielleicht die Grundeinstellung von Bruno Latour, ich weiß, dass du dem zugeneigt bist, vielleicht für hilfreich empfindest, die Grundzüge der planetaren Politik zu verstehen. Also für Bruno Latour ist das politische Subjekt, um das sich alles dreht und was alles praktisch um sich versammelt, die Ökologie. Also die Ökologie als Prozess. Bruno Latour hat eine ökologische Klasse identifiziert und hat die ökologische Klasse näher bestimmt als alle Menschen, denen es darum geht, die Bewohnbarkeit der Erde, des Planeten Erde zu erhalten. Das erinnert mich an die Bleibefreiheit von Redecker. Das ist die ökologische Klasse und der Gegner dieser Politik sind die Menschen und Gruppen natürlich auch, nicht nur Einzelmenschen und Gruppen und Vereinigungen und Assoziationen, die die Bewohnbarkeit der Erde zerstören. Das große Problem bei der ganzen Geschichte ist, also ich zum Beispiel habe den Anspruch an mich selber, dass ich die Bewohnbarkeit der Erde erhalten will und zähle mich jetzt zur ökologischen Klasse. Problem bei mir, ich verbrauche 2,5 Erden durch meinen Lebensstil. Ja, also das ist, habe ich mal ausrechnen lassen und ich dürfte nur eine Erde verbrauchen. Das heißt, objektiv trage ich dazu bei, dass die Bewohnbarkeit der Erde für alle Lebewesen, ich muss noch dazu sagen, dass immer für alle Lebewesen praktisch die Bewohnbarkeit verlangt und nicht nur für den Menschen. Ja. Das heißt, ich trage objektiv dazu bei, dass die Bewohnbarkeit der Erde für alle Lebewesen praktisch abnimmt durch meinen persönlichen Lebensstil, den ich minimieren will, aber irgendwie klappt es doch nicht, auf eine Erde zu kommen. Ja. Das ist das Dilemma. Und da wollte ich jetzt Dipesh Chakrabarty fragen, ob er einen Ausweg aus diesem Dilemma sieht, ja, beziehungsweise ob er die Grundeinstellung von Bruno Latour als Teil seiner Vorstellung von planetarer Politik begreift. Danke.
The question, and there were more than one side to your question, but so Bruno Latour, as you know, wrote this book on the ecological class that you were mentioning with Nikolai Schulz. So in a way, Latour was thinking as a philosopher, as I think Eva is and was. And so as a philosopher, you can say, what are the conditions of possibility of having a state in which humans are protective of the environment, protective of the justice questions between humans, but also justice question between humans and other forms of life. So you can actually ask this question saying, what are the conditions of possibility? But whether the conditions of possibility will be historically realized is a different question. And if I may open up a small disagreement between friends here, and this is kind of putting the spirit of Nietzsche into the question. So I had this discussion with a philosopher who's a degrowth philosopher. And he was speaking, giving a talk about what are the conditions under which we will have the best possible world, given all the damages of today, and we will be able to sustain it. So I said to him, because this is a conversation I can't name him, but his book is translated into German. So I said to him, do you know of any historical evidence in which human beings from different cultures came to a reasonable agreement and sustained it for, let's say, 50 decades without any humans gaming it in any way? And he said, no. So I said, so what gives you the confidence this will be realized? He said, I'm a philosopher. I don't need this kind of evidence. Right? So the question is, when I look at the history of humanity, what I see is an animal that has, even in its condition of being social, being cohesive, having solidarity, that have usually experienced and produced solidarity when either fighting other humans or when killing other animals. So a fishing trawler is a solidarity against fish. And the advantage we have is that we can create technology very quickly. If technology took evolutionary time to be produced, then by the time we produced a fishing trawler, the fish would have learned how to avoid the trawler. So basically we are surprising them with our technology and ambushing them, and that's why we can kill them in such numbers. But my question is that this is a species that has tremendous capacity for compassion. At a certain scale, we see it every day. That has a tremendous capacity for solidarity and a tremendous capacity for killing its own kind. If you look at modern history, the technology, by which I mean infrastructure, that has prolonged human lives, and hospitals are central to them, are actually used during wars to kill people. People bomb hospitals. So my question to you as a philosopher is, are you like my friend who would say to me, Dipesh, I don't care if in history we have not been able to do this. I can logically say this is what, if we were all logical, we would do. And once another important economist philosopher said to me, it's solvable because it's solvable on paper. That you can't solve it in practice because you're not rational enough. But history is full of these irrationalities.
Well,
So,
I'm sure I have many flaws. I'm not sure I have this one. Because in critical theory, we always think with the historical forces. And I would even say that the Latour conception of ecological class, as impressive as it is actually not very materialist, because it is the interest group that shares a certain interest. That's a liberal notion of politics, not a Marxist one that, again, as I said earlier, thinks of the self-activity that will liberate us at a certain type of labor. And you asked, so you said 50 decades, so that would be 500 years, right? That was upheld a sensible practice. Well, I would say, so for instance, actually firefighting was kind of, as an organized mutual aid activity, kind of invented in northern Germany, at least for Western Europe, where I come from. It happens to be there because the Danes and the Vikings always set everything in fire. It took centuries till they started organizing themselves, but it happened in the 11th, 12th century, and it's still going to Delhi, still on a voluntary basis. So that would be an example. And then there are certain fishing practices also, like of course we could go indigenous cultures, which for much longer time have upheld certain sustainable forms of dealing with nature, but even some Danish islanders had fishing practices that up to a few decades ago had thousands of years of being sustainable. So I do think it's possible. And I do think we have to point to those kind of activities to say we need to see more of that, and how can it have power. Since you asked me a question, can I also ask you a question? So it will be very fast.
I'm away from our question, from the audience, but ask me the question and maybe I'll come back.
It's actually a curiosity question. In your distinction between global and planetary, where does agriculture sit? Because obviously with the whole subaltern studies point was to say the peasants are not outside history, and I am actually a peasant daughter, and I can tell you that in German, our way to refer to crops, the German word for crop is culture. So, it's very much part of the human world. So where would agriculture sit in that divide? Or is it maybe one of the things that sort of stitches them together?
Even in indigenous societies, they're not without warfare.
Yeah.
I mean, Richard White's book, Middle Ground, which is actually looking at Native Americans, and they're dealing with Europeans. I mean, they had horrible ways of killing their children. Rape was in Australian Aboriginal culture, I mean, there's been debate about sort of family rape. Or, for instance, just to give you an example, in Australian Aboriginal culture, in certain parts there was a custom, whereas a young man, if you had good spearing skills, you could go to a woman and say, your age, and say, you're not in love with her, but you could say, I will supply you with kangaroo meat all your life. And all the girl children you bear will be mine. So, in exchange for protein, right, there was a certain kind of gender. So, my point is simple. My point is, the philosophical point is that if we had a very complex, true to evolutionary history view of the human being, what is then the we that Violetta, you sometimes talk about? We should do this. And what is the we that I talk about and you talk about? And to me, that we seems like a conditional we. It's really saying, if things were to be all right, then this is what we would have to be like. And I totally like the politics of getting people there. All I'm saying as a historian is that in history does not, once the founder of subaltern studies, Guha, said to me as a historian, he said, Dipesh, in history there's no basis for thinking that humans will always do good things. But I'm just not saying that. I'm simply saying, to me it seems like if you think as a systemic thinker, then you could say, in order to have XYZ, right, I need ABC. But as a historian, what I'm asking is, when I look at human history, I cannot see how we are not moving into a world that would be more conflicted because of the power of the right. Americans are preparing for a more conflicted world. Some of the right-wing people don't even deny climate change. Trump's energy secretary, Chris Wright, actually, in a lecture, in a speech he gave last year, he said climate change is the trade-off for our prosperity and well-being. So I'm just asking this question, we can debate this, but I'm just, given that we are between friends, given there's a question of technology, I thought I would just create a small disagreement in the interest of discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm afraid that we don't have that much time anymore. For one question,
Let's maybe collect a few.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Thank you. So we'll have one question here, and I saw a few hands. Maybe we collect 3 questions, and then we'll wrap it up. Yeah. So would you like to start, or who has the mic now? There. Okay.
Und funktioniert's? Gut. Diesen to try to overcome a little bit this conflict that you stated just now between philosophy and history, maybe one step to give us some new ideas would be to enhance this time perspective of history. If you turn to the book of Graeber and Vengrove, The Dawn of Everything, you can see that in the history of humankind, when we go back like 14,000 years ago, there were quite different structures, quite different ways of living together. And so we could say, at least it's possible. It was possible. Then, of course, we would have to discuss how can we get there once again. But to make a rebound to feminism, in what we know about this early history of mankind, if we go to the burial, as described by Graeber and Vengrove, we go to the burial sites, people buried close together are normally not linked by blood relations. And if they are, some are, then it's among the maternal line and not the... So to add to the conflicts we have, of course, not only capitalism, but also patriarchalism has to be overcome. And just to advertise a little bit this gorgeous exhibition we have at the moment on the museum island of Göbekli Tepe and the structures, the equal structures they built there. Go there, it only runs till the end of next month.
Thank you. I would like to ask you to keep your questions sweet and short, please. 2 more, and then we'll have to finish. Thank you.
Hi, thank you very much. I work in culture. I was going to ask a question about future narratives. I'm surrounded by a lot of new materialism in culture. There's a lot of funding from even oil companies that go into queer new materialist art practice. This troubles me greatly, and I feel like it's being co-opted for a strange new biological future. And there's even a book called Exocapitalism that's making the rounds, and I'm wondering if you can offer a position that doesn't make other cultural workers seem like old school, like, you know, Rosa-Luxemburg-Stiftung like people, but so that we can have similar headway in the discussion of these things. Thank you.
Danke. Hallo, ich bin Sina und ich ja, ich schreibe Science Fiction und bin quasi zwischen dem Abstrakten und dem Konkreten. Und eine große, was mich sehr beschäftigt, ist, dass ja, Menschen ja jetzt auch ins Gefängnis gehen dafür, dass sie gefordert haben, ein Autobahnlimit, ein Tempolimit auf Autobahnen zu haben. Das heißt, was ich damit sagen will, ist der Mangel an Forderungen, die gleichzeitig die Imagination anregen, als auch das Herz und den Verstand. Das beschäftigt mich sehr. Deshalb meine ganz kurze Frage an jeden von den dreien da vorne. Bitte also weil ich stelle mir vor, wenn die Forderung gewesen wäre, seinerzeit, und wir waren da ja alle mehr oder weniger beteiligt, dass zum Beispiel Autos im Privatbesitz gar nicht mehr das Modell sein sollten, sondern wir quasi ein Opt-in-Modell für das Auto zusammenbesitzen haben. Dann könnten wir auf unterschiedliche Weisen die Narrative verbinden, dass wenn Dinge passieren, weil Menschen sich nicht gegenseitig aufeinander aufpassen, weil sie das Auto zusammenbesitzen, haben wir andere Vorsorgestrukturen, während wir überhaupt mal ein anderes Modell von Eigentum natürlich in der Diskussion hätten und nicht nur Remigration als ein starkes Bild. Uns fehlen diese starken Bilder. Daher die Bitte an ganz konkrete Sachen. Ich weiß eben, mein Kollege hat auch schon gefragt nach den Beziehungsfragen. Es ist immer leichter zu sagen, was geht nicht, aber ich wünsche mir sehr von allen drei eine ganz starke, bildliche, konkrete Forderung.
Thank you very much for these excellent questions. I would suggest that we use this last round now for, relating somehow to the questions asked, and also to make a final statement of, what you think would be the most important thing to do in the next few years. So maybe we want to start with Dipesh and then Eva and Violetta in the end, and then we will be finished.
next few years. I would like to see, first of all, and this is also going back to Violetta's point, that we need governments to make the vulnerable populations and the vulnerable species resilient first. So, in other words, the poor, the migrant, the subalterns of today, they are really the most vulnerable groups. As the climate change is unequal in its impact, we know that it's unequal in its impact, so we should do that. I want some global agreements, and this is responding to Eva's point about what I meant by becoming minor, withdrawal, is not some romantic idea of becoming minor, but for the governments to actually follow the planetary limits, boundaries that Johan Rockström and others have been working on. And we have already violated some of these planetary boundaries. How much water, fresh water can we use? How much carbon dioxide can we put out? We need some global agreements on this, and effective agreements. The Paris Agreement is the most ineffective agreement. How we get there is, of course, a different question. And as an educationist, I feel that courses, disciplines need to change. They need to talk to each other more. And that's why the conversation between a philosopher and a historian is probably useful. A conversation between a historian and evolutionary biology is probably useful. And I'll just make this last statement with the fire example, which is a very good example. And as you know, indigenous societies, also responding to the last question, particularly hunting and gathering societies have been the most sustainable societies in human history, in my reading. So the dawn of everything, the book is right. But you have to begin thinking about any change. You have to begin that from the proposition in my head that there are 8 billion people. And without modern agriculture, which is not good, without fertilizers and pesticides, 40% of humanity would go without food. That's the calculation given in Vaclav-Smil's book, How the World Really Works. It's very hard to imagine a modern hospital and modern hygiene without plastics. So there are few things that are critical. I mean, the human longevity is based on biotechnology and modern infrastructures. Evolution didn't select us for long life. They selected turtles and tortoises. So there's a certain kind of intimacy between our lives and the modern technologies. And these technologies are also, they have a negative impact. So we have to think about, I think politics would be the way, whether it's through social movements or whether through parliamentary legislation, because people follow law more than they follow market kind of directions, right? If you make certain kind of, India for instance, I'll say this and finish, when there was a meeting in South Africa, the last meeting they had, from transitioning away from old style air conditioners to the new style air conditioners, which actually are less polluting, but require more skilled labor to put them up. And most of Europe, I think, has the new style air conditioners, the US has, the third world countries don't. And in this conference, India bargained the hardest to be the slowest country to transition. Why? Because the demand for air conditioners is going up. Growing up in India, the only air conditioner people can actually afford are the old style air conditioners, which are actually very damaging for the environment. So India was making this trade-off. But I think we need global regulation of these things. And what the government needs to do in India is to subsidize poor people so that they can buy modern air conditioners rather than these damaging air conditioners. But again, as I was saying, how we get to these global agreements, how we get to these global precautions. So I think of precautionary measures. So remember that indigenous societies were societies that supported smaller populations, which is why their lands were taken by the Europeans as settler colonial societies. India was never to be taken by Europeans for settlement because by the 17th century, India just seemed too crowded to Europeans. Benares is described in all historical documents as crowded. And I kind of think if I go to Benares now, I think I would rather go to 17th century Benares and live there. But the Europeans thought that was crowded. Europeans thought their own societies were getting crowded. Locke, in the first treatise on government, says, you look at America, and land is as abundant as water. So remember that these societies were very sustainable because they actually sustained smaller scale populations. And now we are dealing with 8 billion people. These societies can be scaled up. So I'll finish by quoting my friend Eduardo Viveiros de Castro, who is a very well-known Brazilian anthropologist, who created this conception that West is multicultural, but mono-natural, that nature is one. And the indigenous people of Americas are multinatural and multicultural. But he made exactly your point. In a recent article he published, he said, I'm not saying that these indigenous societies can be solution to our present problems. But I'm saying that they document that another way of life is possible. And then he has a very tragic statement. He just says, I just hope that another way of ending this capitalist life is also possible.
Yeah. I think we need a separate event on agriculture here. So I think one of the best accounts is George Monbiot's Regenesis, and I think that goes a long way to refute some of those claims that you need fertilizers to feed the 8 billions. And then part of the problem, I mean, we have actually too much nitrate from an ecological perspective, and we don't, the one fertilizer that we're running out of, phosphate, cannot be industrially produced. So there isn't even a technological solution. The only solution would be better cycling of the phosphate that is in the planet. Anyway, but we do a separate thing on that. I try to just briefly, thank you for bringing up The Dawn of Everything. I also loved reading it, and I think it does give you this kind of hope of a longer time span. And at the same, and I think some of the hopes, you know, to overcome a certain type of patriarchal family form, one can draw inspiration from it. And yet I think if we want to think of the future, we need to take everything that is there now with us. So, you know, all the new forces we have unleashed, the new capacities we've learned. So it will be a different free future. But I also agree that freedom might be possible. And Zina, yeah, thank you for pushing us. And it's great to see you here. But, you know, if I could come up with something better, I would have written a book on it already. So for me, really, the freedom to stay for everyone is the most concrete and visual that I get it. And I do totally agree that we need maximum demands on the left, and that this hope that by asking for little reformist things in the bike lane here and that we're losing. But that, as modest and little as it sounds, I think saying the freedom to stay for all implies to change everything. And with the culture, I mean, you know, I don't know how to, I teach at an art school this semester. So I'm trying to teach them some old materialism and some ecofeminism, some other things than new materialism. But there are those fashions, you know, they change. I think it will change. But what is more important is that I observe there with great admiration a very stern and alert awareness of what the students call art washing. So that, you know, certain types of funding use the art world to get themselves a certain image. And there is a lot of protest against it, and some people have become very brave. So I guess then, you know, one should hope for those forces to reorganize and also reject and scandalize certain types of money laundering through the art world.
The last word, Violetta.
So maybe I start with the last question of the concrete demand. I mean, there would be so many demands, right? What we would wish, what changes. But I do it back to where I have my own main field also in the moment, as well in my neighborhoods as well as in the parliament. And actually it would be affordable housing that is warm in the winter and cold in summer. That is in public ownership, and where we don't have to fear that the bill is coming in the end of the month. And not because it's maybe the first thing that I am thinking of when I get up in the morning, but because we ask the people, where is the biggest problem? I mean, and in Germany, when we knocked on all the doors, it's what most of the people said, that the exhaustion is increasing because they don't know how to afford the housing, or they can't move, but they can stay. And we have actually all these topics in the housing thing. And also because I think it's an issue, like when we think, like, how can we change this power relation? I think it starts also at home, and it's connected to all the different fields. I mean, the housing sector is a very feminist question. That's mostly the place where care work also takes place. And it's also one that connects to the international sphere and to all the geopolitical conflicts at the moment. I mean, we have at the moment this Frau Reiche, so the Ministry of Energy, Mrs. Rich, I don't know if she has the perfect name, who wants to bring in a new law where they say also in the future you can do fossil fuel heating. And it's not it's the landlord who decides what will be the heating. And should I now tell the tenant he is not part of the ecological class? As you said, with reference to Latour, he can't decide what is the heating system in his building. He just has to pay the rent. And I think, so that's also where we say, when we don't have to want Trump in our basement, and if we want to have independence, and we also know what the technology would be. I mean, we know what the solutions would be, how we could reorganize the whole housing and energy market also in Germany. We also have this international connections. And not only because we, of course, not only because we want to have no fossil fuel from Trump, but because also we fight that all these wars are stopping over these energy resources. And also because I mean, home is important because if we have a safe home to stay or to live or whatever, it also means that we have power to do all the other struggles that we have to fight for, as the social protests that we have to fight for in the moment, or against all this militarist perspective. So that's why I think that home is very important, and we should fight there, and also because there we can create the connections. Like when we are good organized with our neighbors and we manage to fight there for good housing, and the next climate crisis comes, we know who to talk to and to organize ourselves, how to deal with the event, because we have to do it in a self-organized way. Government won't do it, they are cutting everywhere. So I think also for creating these solidarity networks and our own infrastructure, that's a good point. And maybe also just to connect it to the discussions, because we spoke so much about freedom. And I mean, we're checking at the moment if we can fight against this law of Mrs. Rich. Actually, I like that name more, of the ministry. That's also about the question of intertemporal freedom. Like when we don't act now, we will not cut only the freedom that we have now, but also of the next generations. And the climate movement in the last year managed at least to get this law that is still there, and we try that the government has to fulfill it, even if they change the power balances. So we even have this intertemporal freedom inside that thing. So that would be my demand, but I know there are a lot of more. But I think if we can all live in an affordable, in a renewable, in a public way with collective infrastructure, it's a good start to fight all the other things as well.
Thank you so much to all of you, Dipesh, Eva, Violetta, for this wide-ranging and very inspiring discussion. I really enjoyed it. Thank you to all of you for asking excellent questions. We would like to invite you to, there's some drinks outside here, there's some snacks over there in that room, and there's also a bookstall here, I think there, where Eva and probably also Dipesh will be available to sign books if you want to buy them. So please enjoy the evening. Oh, of course.
So since we're sitting in this room, in a building named after Rosa Luxemburg, I just want to remember a sentence that I've not found yet, but I've heard it attributed to Rosa Luxemburg, which said, "Trust the crisis." It will do a lot of work for us.